Well, good morning. My name is George Maxwell. I'm the vicar of the Cathedral of St. Philip in Atlanta, Georgia. Today is the 24th of May, which is the first Sunday after the Feast of the Ascension. And you have joined the old-fashioned Sunday school. We're glad you're here. We're also glad that Dan is here because Dan has subdued the evil forces of Zoom that disrupted our class last week. And through this presentation, there are going to be several questions. So Dan, how should we do that? And how else should we be?
Thanks, George. Yeah, when it comes time for questions, we will. I'll just let you all unmute yourself, and we'll jump in. That's tended to work the last couple of weeks.
Excellent. Most of the presentation for today, and in fact the next several weeks, is going to come from a trilogy written by David Brenner: Surrender to Love, The Gift of Being Yourself, and Desiring. They're small books, and I actually encourage you to buy and read them. Usually I'll show you the book I'm drawing from, but it's not something I think you're sincerely going to enjoy. But in this case, I really do invite you to get and read them. There are study guides in them, and they seem to do a good job of chronicling the journey that we have been describing literally all year, the journey of being created in the image of God, and then through our faith and our growth and our life, becoming more like God. And we'll talk a little bit about that today as well. Yes, these books are available in the Cathedral bookstore. And while we think the bookstore is going to be open soon, you can order online now and they'll ship it to you, or you can stop by and pick it up. So here's my favorite meme of the week. Tomorrow is the Feast of Ascension. To those who wonder what it's about, it's the day when Jesus started to work from home. I saw another yard sign in my walk this morning that said, last week was the longest year of my life. But I do think there's resonance with the Feast of the Ascension and this sentiment, the day Jesus started to work from home, which is why I've asked as a prompt for the class, where did Jesus actually go when he ascended up beyond the clouds? This is perhaps my favorite painting of the Ascension, showing the Jesus rising up into his glory and those gathered around him and all the emotions that you can see on those faces. But where was it that Jesus actually went? We're used to reading in Scripture spatial metaphors where up is good and down is bad. And we've in fact talked about the spiritual life that way, as if gaining altitude was the equivalent of gaining consciousness. And so moving up meant gaining more conscious, becoming more aware, rising. But I think there's another spatial metaphor in Scripture that may be more relevant here, and that is descending. We've talked about Jesus's spirituality as being one of self-emptying. The patristic fathers used to say that Jesus became human so that we could become divine.
Hello.
Hello. But what did they mean by that? I think they meant that Jesus became human so that we could understand that we were divine and grow in that divinity by following Jesus. And so one answer to where did Jesus go when he rose up beyond the clouds is that Jesus actually then descended into all of creation, where he continues to be present, where the Christ is always present, which would suggest that while our spiritual life is a journey, and we have an intuitive sense of that, I think, we grow and we become more when we die than we were when we were alive. There's been a change in us as we return to God. But it's also true that we already have everything that we need. That a lot of what we're doing in the spiritual journey is uncovering the divinity that is already in us. We said, when we looked at Genesis, we noticed that the scripture says we are created in the image of God and we grow to become like God, as if there is already divinity in us, and growing into that divinity is the point of the spiritual journey. In fact, the purpose for which we were created. So that's the answer that I like to where did Jesus go? Not up into the clouds where he's distant from us, though it may often feel that way, but actually into all of creation where he, and in fact the whole Trinity, is always available to us. It's just a matter of our becoming aware of it, of our getting out of the way so that we can participate in it. But we all know, I think, in our very being, that if we can't let go of our effort to control everything in our lives, if we can't align ourselves to some transcendent being, we will never be fully alive. And again, calling upon the patristic fathers, the glory of God is a human being fully alive. So as we work through today, I want you to keep that idea in mind, that Christ, and in fact the entire Trinity, is present throughout creation. We as humans seem to have a unique capability to see that if we allow ourselves to see that. And that's what our spiritual practices are really about, creating enough room for us to notice what is already there. Thomas Keating says something very similar to this when he says, the Ascension is Christ's return to the heart of all creation, where he dwells now in his glorified humanity. So again, Keating is saying what I've been trying to describe, that it's not an ascent away from us, leaving us separated from God. It is fundamentally a descent, which makes Christ present throughout creation and present to us as well. Paul says something very similar in the letter to the Colossians. In that renewal, there is no longer Greek nor Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave and free, but Christ is all and in all, which is to say, Christ is there in creation and already in us as well. Now, one traditional way of thinking about how we gain access to this Christ who is always present, how we discover this Christ that is always present, it's what's known as the threefold path. The first step along this journey would be called purgation. It involves awakening and encounter and following. You might think of it as falling in love. I hope you can remember a time when you fell in love, when it just seemed to be obvious, and being where the other person was all you wanted. And so you got up from where you were and followed, or together you got up and charted your own path. When I think of this stage of the journey, I think of the disciples and Jesus calling them to be disciples. And time after time after time, Jesus just appears. And there's something about the authority of his very person that causes them to see immediately what they should do next. They spring up or out of their boat or dropping their nets that they are mending, call others to join them and follow Jesus. They didn't seem to know exactly what they were doing. They just seemed to know they needed to be doing it. And then they spent the rest of their ministries figuring out what it was that Jesus was trying to teach them. Purgation. This scene you can see on this slide is a depiction of the calling of the disciples from the Gospel of John, and that is the beloved disciple there. Again, simply following Jesus because he appeared and needed following. The second stage, though, would be illumination. And illumination is understanding, at least in part, what you're doing. And so you typically, as I said, you discover it. It's not something you achieve. It's not a self-development. We can't just lay out a program for happiness, follow its steps, and arrive at the destination. This is not to say that programs for happiness aren't helpful, but as long as we're following a self-development, we are always still in control. It is always about our ego fortifying itself so that it can attain mastery, so that it can have more control over our lives. And while dealing and responding to things that happen to us in a good way is powerful and helpful and meaningful, it sometimes gets in the way of the spiritual journey. And as St. Bernard of Clairvaux says here, illumination is movement from loving God for my sake to loving God for his sake, which is another way of capturing that movement out of egocentricity and into divinity. Out of egocentricity, where our egos are, they're focused only on our own kind of self-promotion, only on our own control. And we learn that what we really need is control or approval or security. And we find our identities there. We find our meaning there. And that usually works for a bunch of us, for a number of us for a while, and then something happens. Something happens that breaks that open. It might be a midlife crisis, but it might be something else, a failure or a death. Usually it's tied up with suffering and somehow. It is that moment when all of the work of the ego, which we've so arduously driven, doesn't achieve whatever objective we know we want, or it does and we're not happy with it. We've talked about all this before, and it's usually in that moment when somehow our hearts are broken. But if we've been following the path of love, our hearts will not be broken and shattered, they will be broken open, making us more available to the love of God, which you will remember is always present in creation, waiting there for us to discover it, waiting for our ego to step out of the way enough so that we can be engaged and open. Now, when that happens, I often think that the picture of God that we receive is a lot like the prodigal father. You know, the parable of the prodigal son, I've told you, I think is misnamed. Yes, the prodigal son is prodigious in his waste and wantonness, and the elder brother is prodigal in his selfishness and greed and egocentric behavior. But it is the prodigal father who is reckless with his love, who runs out onto the road to greet his son when he returns. This, as I know you know because we've done it before, is Rembrandt's rendition of that moment. And I think, as Henry Nouwen pointed out, looking at the father's hands on the back of the son speaks volumes about this love, the firm embrace, the gathering in of the son, and the welcoming back of a lost member of the family. God, I think, like the prodigal father, is waiting for us to come to our senses, waiting for us to remember the love that we had, waiting for us to return in order to accept the forgiveness and grace that the prodigal father offers. Another view on this stage of illumination comes from Nelson Mandela and his biography, Walk to Freedom. And he says this: freedom is indivisible. The chains on any one of my people were chains on all of them. The chains on all of my people were the chains on me. That I think is a powerful recognition of what you see and feel when you move from being only concerned about yourself, the me, to being aware of your connections with the rest of humanity, the we, movement from me to we. And it is an awareness that we are all connected. It is an awareness that no matter the work of our ego to set us up as something different and in control, we actually are completely vulnerable to what happens in the world, and what happens to other people hurts us too. This, of course, is readily evident in discrimination of all kinds. It takes us a while to figure it out, of course, but when other people are bound or oppressed or victimized or scapegoated, we somehow are less. But it is only through illumination that we get a sense of that. It is only through illumination in the presence of God's love, our awareness that we too have been forgiven, that we learn we are not free if they are not free. And as we grow into this, as we plumb its spiritual depths, then we change the way we look at the world, and we change the way we look at other people. It's as if we have gained altitude and consciousness with which to see more, and yet we did that by descending into our depths. Now, in the traditional description of spirituality, this is often a distinction that is made between the soul and the spirit, that the soul takes us more deeply into ourselves. You might think of the power of soul music that many of us grew up with, that takes us more deeply into ourselves. And it does that, by the way, by having taken us more deeply into the Black experience in America. That's what gave birth to the soul of soul music. But I grew up loving all of that and having no idea about what gave it its birth. It had a universal appeal. And therefore, I think it's a good example of what the soul can do for us. It takes us down into ourselves. And then the spirit is the fire in the belly. The spirit is what draws us up out of ourselves and aligns us with some transcendent thing, something bigger than us, making us bigger in the process. Moving, if you will, from being created in the image of God to growing into the likeness of God. And I think, as an aside, this is not a bad way to see Ascension and Pentecost. Ascension, where Jesus leaves, which leaves the disciples in crisis, and Pentecost, which happens only 10 days later when the Spirit returns and the disciples feel connected, having moved from the me of Ascension to the we of Pentecost. I want to just leave this without any setup. Let's see if you can detect, well, I'm going to set it up actually, aren't I? I want to see if you can detect the movement from me to we in this interview.
Murray Shiskow, who has been my dear friend for over 30 years, kicked off Tootsie with the thought of how would you be different if you had been born a woman? It was in a conversation we had one time. Not what does it feel like to be a woman, because all sexes have asked themselves the question, what does it feel like to be, what would it feel like to be the opposite sex? But his question was different. If you were born a woman, how would you be different? So that kicked off, it would take too long to answer how we then got involved in Tootsie for about 2 years before we even got a director, just working on different drafts of the script. But I did go to Columbia and I asked them if they would spend the money to do makeup tests so that I could look like a woman. And if I couldn't look like a woman, they would agree not to make the movie. And they said, what do you mean? I just somehow intuitively felt that unless I could walk down the streets of New York and not have dressed as a woman and not have people turn and say, who's that guy in drag, or turn for any reason, that, who's that freak? Unless I could do that, I didn't want to make the film. I didn't want the audience to suspend their believability. When we at that point and looked at it on screen, I was shocked that I wasn't more attractive. And I said, now you have me looking like a woman. Now maybe a beautiful woman, because I thought I should be beautiful. If I was going to be a woman, I would want to be as beautiful as possible. And they said to me, that's as good as it gets. That's as beautiful as we can get you, Charlie. And it was at that moment that I had an epiphany, and I went home and started crying, talking to my wife. And I said, I have to make this picture. And she said, why? And I said, because I think I'm an interesting woman when I look at myself on screen. And I know that if I met myself at a party, I would never talk to that character, because she doesn't fulfill physically the demands that we're brought up to think women have to have in order for us to ask them out. She says, what are you saying? And I said, there's too many interesting women I have not had the experience to know in this life, because I have been brainwashed. And that was never a comedy for me.
I'm a big Dustin Hoffman fan, and I loved the movie. But I'm hoping that you can see in this clip how Dustin Hoffman's soul is descending into himself. He is feeling what it would be like to be somebody else. And then his spirit is inspiring him to reach out of himself, to grow. And in that process, he is expanding his awareness. He is growing his consciousness, and he wants to be a different person. And as he says, it was never a comedy for him. So on the one hand, suffering can be the crisis that brings us to the point of illumination. But another way that often happens is by an encounter with otherness. Grace, in fact, the grace of God, could be described, I think, as an encounter with the other, an encounter with something we feel is other than us, which then draws us out of us, moving from he to we. So I want to pause. I hope you've got a sense of this kind of model, the workings of soul and spirit, and how otherness can challenge us and bring us out of ourselves, aligning ourselves with something bigger than us. And I'd like for you to take 2 minutes and think about a time when that happened to you. Was there a time when your encounter with otherness caused you to realize something about yourself and inspired you to reach out in a different way to connect with other people? It doesn't have to be a big thing. It could be a very pedestrian thing. But is there a time when you can, your soul taking you down and your spirit drawing you out? I'm going to give you 2 minutes to think about this. Okay, I invite you back from that reflection. I hope you were able to find a time that popped up, that arose in your memory. Is there anyone that would like to share what they remembered? Right. I'm going to trust that's because your memories were deep and intimate and not yet ready for sharing. To quickly summarize then, the stage of illumination often comes about because of a crisis of loss. This is a detail on the painting of the Ascension that I showed you at the beginning of the presentation, where you can see with greater clarity and focus the looks on the faces of those that are gathered around. So the experience of suffering, which opens us up, which breaks our hearts, is, of course, one way this happens. And then the other way is the encounter with openness. There are many ways, of course. These are the two that I find most often occur in our lives: suffering and the experience of otherness. But coming out of the stage of illumination, coming out of the movement of soul and spirit that moves us from me to we, is what is typically referred to as union with God. And that can be a difficult phrase to penetrate, because sometimes we associate union with God with somehow attaining a mystical unity with the divine, in which we lose ourselves entirely. And either we don't know what that really means, or we think it's just for the spiritual elite, or it's not something we actually want. I would like for my identity to stay intact in some way. But I think it is not quite that. When the mystics talk about union with the divine, while it sometimes includes mystical experiences and losing yourself in a particular, often it's about drawing more to your own center. Here's what David Benner says in his book, Surrender to Love. The more we are drawn in love toward the center of our being, the less clear the boundaries between God and what we experienced as our self become, which is to say, if Christ and in fact the Trinity are part of creation and part of us, that as we learn to get beyond our own egocentricity, beyond that self that we have worked so hard to create, we will discover something inside of us. We will discover something that looks, feels, and actually is God. We will never know it entirely, but we will know that it's there. And as we begin to align ourselves with it, as we begin to participate in its life, having its heart, having its eyes as we look out to the world, then we will grow in our consciousness, grow in our spirituality, grow closer to God. And then, of course, what we will long for, what we will yearn for is just to be that, not to be in the way at all. But for most of us, if that's going to happen, it's going to have to wait for another life. But I don't want you to be frightened off when you hear things like union with God or unitive experiences, because really it's about a gradual revelation of the God that is already in us. And as we embrace that God, encounter that God, align ourselves with that God, we activate our own divinity and we grow more and more to be like God. And that at the end is what the spiritual path is really all about. How do we live the resurrected life of Jesus? Now, here's a very prominent preacher locally who preached a wonderful sermon this morning on the Ascension. So if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to do so. You can find it on our website. But I also want you to look at that piece of art there over the dean's right shoulder, which is another depiction of the Ascension, or at least it could be, that kind of inspiring spirit as Jesus is drawn out of himself. Somehow it seems to have a more hopeful tone to it to me when I look at it than the previous painting that I showed you. So union with God. One way to do or think about union with God is to think about Mary, the Virgin Mary, Christ's mother. This is a fresco by Fra Angelica, which appears in St. Mark's in Florence. And it is every bit as stunning in person as you might imagine, though it almost sneaks up on you. You think it's going to be like the Mona Lisa in a separate room in a fancy museum, and really it's just at the top of the stairs. But I think Mary's obedience is how we talk about it. Her obedience to the angel's call is a wonderful model for the spiritual life, for this union. And another way to think about it is not obedience, but not submitting to another power surrender, but an acceptance surrender, a commitment surrender. Where, as I said, we find that God inside of us and we commit ourselves to that presence. And we let it guide us as we go through our lives. In the spiritual tradition of the Christian church, that's often called surrender in the East. In the West, we talk about obedience. But whether you want to think of it as surrender or think of it as obedience, I urge you to think of the Virgin Mary as the model of faith, hearing the call of God and giving herself over to it entirely, giving her body to it, giving her mind to it, giving her soul and spirit to it for the rest of her life. So I want to talk about two practices, but before I do that, I'm wondering if there are any questions about that third stage, union with God. Is how I described it, for example, any different than how you conceived of it?
George?
Yes.
Good morning. I think what I'm really struck with is the sense of otherness and being drawn out of the self, that part of the journey that you have so nicely expressed. Conceptually, it's not something that I hadn't fathomed, but I did have a very clear experience of that earlier this week. When I attended the first of 3 video sessions that Catherine Meeks has put together on lament in the current COVID crisis. And she had some very articulate people as part of her panel this first session this last week, describing the plight of the homeless in Atlanta. Kim Jackson, who is on the clergy and is actually running for political office, has been meeting regularly with homeless folks and talked about how actually opening the toilet rooms, the restrooms in parks, which have been locked, would make a really big difference for these people that are homeless right now. And there's that level of detail brought me out of myself in a new and different way. That was otherness to me. It very clearly felt and experienced. And I find your words about how that reflects can be seen as part of the spiritual journey to be very helpful.
Well, thank you, Harris. I'm glad. I think, though, that you have really given us another wonderful example of just how that works. And sometimes that's described as being shocked into consciousness, where the otherness comes in a way we didn't expect. You know, like if you're going to go engage folks who are in a dramatically different station of life than you, you know it's different. But if you're really attentive, if you're really aware, it can shock you when you find out that you're really the same, right? And that's what I think causes that movement. You can see some of that in one of the depictions of the Ascension, where the disciples are left there gazing at Jesus, and Jesus kind of says, stop doing that. But I want to say that silence and gazing at Jesus is a way to attend to our inner life. And if you want to test as to whether that's working, whether you are opening yourself adequately, you'll get it when you're drawn out to go do something. So contemplation and action are never separate. Action without contemplation has its own challenges, and contemplation without action never allows you to get to the connections that we're hoping you're going to feel, which is why I've been encouraging all of us as part of this spiritual journey to work in moments of stillness and silence, and then act, connect with others, engage in service. It should work that way. Your inner development should issue in service to others. So thank you, Harrison, for unknowingly giving me that platform to render that separate little sermon. Any other thoughts or challenges? Does this not make sense or not account for something that you have experienced? Okay. Well, let me, as we work towards closing, suggest two practices of surrender. Surrender itself, I think, is a spiritual practice that is right at the core of everything we've been talking about, which is why I think Mary is such a wonderful model. But to make that more concrete, I want to go back to the welcome prayer. We've talked about the welcome prayer before. It's an easy, simple prayer that is actually kind of hard to do and takes its own repetition to master. But there are 3 steps. When something challenges you, frustrates you, upsets you, you can feel your body starting to react to that. Then you focus on it, which is often not what I want to do. If I feel that reaction begin, I just want to distance myself from it. But the welcome prayer invites you to focus on that. And then when you've identified where it is and what it is, to welcome it. As if you are a collection of many selves and you're there at the door offering entrance, hospitality to this particular feeling, which you don't want. And then the 3rd step is to let go of it. So focus, welcome, release. What's really dawning on me as I try and fail repeatedly to use this prayer is how critical it is to the larger concept of surrender. Because even though it's happening in the moment, you can see, I think, that it really includes all 3 of those stages that we've been talking about. By focus and welcome and release, you're practicing the thing that you need to do repeatedly in order to have your ego step aside and allow the Christ that is in you to emerge, in order to let the me step aside so that you can become part of the we that is waiting to emerge. And so I'm thinking back upon C.S. Lewis, who was the first one to capture my attention with the idea that everything we do, every little decision we make, is a decision for or against God. It may sound overly dramatic, but as Lewis describes it, what he means is every decision you make is moving your life a little bit one way or the other. And your ability to go anywhere is about making little decisions that build on little decisions that build on little decisions. And over time, they grow. And over time, you become a different person. If you've had to engage in any kind of physical fitness program or any kind of diet, you know that while there may be a moment at the beginning where you really go after it, you've just got to get into a different pattern. And you've got to do little things that let you stay in a directionally correct course. So once again, I'm suggesting that you look at the welcome prayer as a concrete thing that you can do in a concrete part of life that helps train you into this pattern of behavior. Now, the second practice is letting go of loss. And it strikes me this is a perfect time to be thinking about this. We have all experienced some real loss in the last 3 months. In some cases, that loss has been tragic. The loss of someone that we love, the loss of a job, the loss of housing. In some cases, that loss has been more pedestrian. The loss of time with other people, the loss of boundaried space in which I could be still, the loss of markings throughout my day that let me manage my life. But I encourage you in any case to identify those losses. So unlike the welcome prayer, which is right now, where do I feel in my body? Letting go of loss is about reaching back into your memory and pulling up or letting arise those losses that are still there, that you're still feeling. And then to let go of them. And this is a place where lament, as Harris identified it, is a very helpful thing. The songs of lament, or the prayers of lament, or the process of grief, but they're designed to let go of the loss. If you, for example, look at people who have suffered what seemed like what was a life-altering injury or loss, and then through letting go of it, not the sadness entirely, but the debilitating effects of your reaction to it, found another life that was rich and found another way to be that was rich for them because they integrated that loss into who they were, and they were more because of it. They, if you will, increased their level of consciousness, their awareness, in order to draw closer to God, is how I would describe that. So think about these two practices as we go through the next week. The welcome prayer, focus, welcome, release, and letting go of loss. Find a time when you can identify those losses that I know you've suffered and work on letting go of them and see if that doesn't make you freer, if that doesn't allow you to find God more easily, if that doesn't give you energy to align yourself with something that is transcendent to yourself. Because it is there that you will find surrender or obedience, and it is there that you will find the life-giving Spirit of God. Well, that'll give you a full week, but to ensure that you have all of that, do you have any questions before we close?
George, Mary,
Dan, can you repeat that?
You know, I'm not catching that audio either. I'm sorry that I'm not sure who that is on the Godly Play Foundation board, but I can't hear that either. I'm not sure if others can.
Well, I suspect I know who it is. Ask Mary Hunter if she can use the chat.
Your laundry.
There she is.
And there came in the spirit. I was in the basement folding laundry. Sorry.
I do not think the audio is coming through, Mary Hunter.
One of the things that has really me throughout this presentation this morning is how not just these spiritual practices are so important, but how the okay.
So we are blessed with a very unstable internet in our home. And when you spend all of your time on the internet, its instability slowly becomes your own instability. This is what I've learned about my spiritual vulnerability this week.
George, this is Susan. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. While we wait for Mary Hunter's audio to work, I just wanted to make a comment that I think this letting go of loss concept is really important, and something that I have been using this time when we've been separated to really focus on. And I've found it at the same time incredibly meaningful and growth producing and scary. And so I would just encourage all of us to pray for each other in this process, because it's the kind of thing that when you know other people are holding you in prayer in that process, it makes the scary parts bearable.
Thank you, Susan.
Can I try one more time?
Please do.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So what I was trying to say is similar in the same vein, I think, of Susan's comment, but how much it struck me and reminded me that having experiences of otherness and having the capacity and the support to let go of loss, all of that is such a critical piece of the Christian community. And so even when what we're doing is just gathering together, all of those processes are supported, I think. And particularly from my time of working in the church and really deeply being involved in the lives of other people. But I think this was true in the church I grew up in too, that you just expand that intimacy beyond your own household, and it allows you to have more and more of those experiences. So I'm missing church and really being together.
Yes, thank you.
Although folding the laundry during your Sunday school class was very productive today.
Excellent, excellent. I'll kind of close again. I know some of us have suffered really tragic losses, but I think the day-to-day losses matter too. And for example, we've been thinking, as some of you know, kind of had to cancel some of our vacation plans this summer, but as much as a loss as that was, we're also aware that we're missing our friends. And usually if you go away on vacation in the summer, like you've seen your friends and you're going to come back to your friends, but it's been months since I've seen some of you in person or been able to gather with our neighbors beyond waving at each other across the street. So I'm looking forward to some of that, but aware that those small things do add up. All right, and I know we're coming to the end of our time, but I hope you'll let some of that sink in, and it'll be a source of energy for you as you go through the week. I want to introduce you to a new prayer. This is David Benner's loose translation of something Paul said in his letter the Ephesians. But what I'd like for you to do is unmute yourselves, everyone, or Dan can do it for you, and for us to say this prayer together. Now, we know how this works. Once we do that, the system is not going to be able to catch us in unison. So it's going to be broken up, and we're going to be going at different paces, and there are going to be delays. And I encourage you to persevere, because there's something about that cacophony of sound that nevertheless signals community to me. The Lord be with you.
Also,
with you.
These are items that are really critical to
Let us
protect
pray.
individuals. We've learned a lot about this virus, but we now need to translate that
I ask
that
that God give
God,
you
give you power for your spirit to grow strong,
Lord, I pray
and
for
that
you.
and grounded in love,
I give you the power.
be able to understand the breadth and the length
And
and
grounded
depth
in love.
of Christ's everlasting love for you.
And the length, the height and the depth of Christ's everlasting love for you. Amen.
And I think
Also with you.
Americans are amazingly
Thanks be to God. Thanks be to God.